Margaret Maggie Cole had never been the type to rely on others when something needed to be done, and after losing her husband 3 years earlier, that self-reliance had only hardened into something almost unshakable. The small house on the edge of the town had been their shared project, a place they'd chosen together for its wide yard, quiet surroundings, and the kind of privacy that city neighborhoods never allowed. They had spent weekends shaping the property into something that felt entirely theirs, planting trees, building raised garden beds, and, most importantly to Maggie, designing and erecting the fence that now encircled the lot. It wasn't just a barrier of timber and metal. It was a line they had drawn together, a statement that what lay inside belonged to them and them alone. Her husband had been a careful planner, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once, and Maggie, an architect by profession, had taken pride in ensuring that the fence was not only strong and secure but harmonious with the landscape they had built. Every post was anchored in concrete, every panel treated to withstand the seasons, and every detail bore the unmistakable signature of their shared craftsmanship. After he passed away, the fence took on a weight Maggie had never anticipated. It wasn't just about keeping the world out or keeping her aging Labrador, Ralph, safe inside. It became a part of her connection to him, a physical embodiment of the life they had built together. Ralph was a big, slow-moving dog now, his muzzle whitened with age, but he still patrolled the fence line every morning and evening as if it were his duty to inspect each board and corner. Maggie often stood on the porch watching him, taking comfort in the rhythm of his steps and the quiet assurance that nothing could intrude without her knowing. Life in the neighborhood was generally calm, though over the past year she had noticed more activity on the vacant lot that bordered her property. Surveyors had been there a few times, standing in the weeds with tripods and bright vests, scribbling on clipboards. Trucks would sometimes appear for a day or two and then disappear again without explanation. She had assumed that the lot was being prepared for sale or perhaps a new build, but no one had approached her about it, and she saw no reason to worry. That changed on a Tuesday morning that began like any other. Maggie had been in the kitchen making coffee when Ralph's deep, throaty bark broke through the stillness. It was his alert bark, the one he used for strangers at the door or when another dog strayed too close to the property. She stepped to the window, mug in hand, and froze. A bulldozer was idling at the edge of her yard, its massive blade angled toward the fence like a battering ram. 2 men in reflective vests stood beside it, one holding a set of rolled-up documents, the other gesturing toward her property line as if directing an operation. Even from the window she could see the tension in Ralph's posture, the way he ran the length of the fence, barking at the machine that loomed over their world. Maggie's first instinct was disbelief. Surely there had been a mistake, some misunderstanding that could be resolved with a few words. But the bulldozer's engine roared louder, and the man with the documents pointed directly at the section of fence her husband had installed himself. In that moment, the quiet security she had cultivated over years cracked, replaced by a cold rush of adrenaline and a single, undeniable thought. Someone was about to cross a line they had no right to cross. Maggie didn't waste time staring from the window. She set her coffee down so hard that some of it sloshed over the rim and onto the counter, grabbed the keys that hung on the hook near the door, and stepped outside with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone who wasn't about to let a problem grow any bigger than it already was. The early morning air was cool, but the rumble of the bulldozer's engine was a hot, vibrating presence in the ground beneath her feet. Ralph was still barking in that deep, warning tone, pacing along the inside of the fence, his eyes locked on the men beyond it. As she approached the gate, one of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-leathered skin and a hard hat, turned toward her. He had that look of someone who had already decided the outcome of this encounter, the faint curl at the corner of his mouth suggesting that whatever objection she might raise, it would be brushed aside like an inconvenience. "What's going on here?" Maggie demanded, loud enough to cut through the growl of the engine. She kept her voice even but firm, aware that showing too much emotion too soon would give them something to dismiss as mere agitation. The second man, younger and leaner with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward holding the rolled-up documents. He unrolled them with a practiced flick and presented a laminated map clipped to the top. "Ma'am," he began, in that infuriatingly calm tone people use when they're about to say something outrageous, "this section of your fence is standing on land that has been reallocated for community access. We've got the approval to clear it, starting today." Maggie didn't even glance at the map before responding. "That's my property," she said flatly. "My husband and I built that fence ourselves, and it's been here for years. You don't have any right to touch it." The younger man tapped the bottom corner of the map with a gloved finger. "It's all right here. Boundary changes approved last month, based on an older agreement filed with the county. You signed off on it." He said it with such certainty that for a moment Maggie wondered if she had misheard, but then the absurdity of the claim settled in. She had never signed any such thing. She held out her hand for the map, but the man didn't give it to her. Instead, he flipped another page on his clipboard and pointed to a scanned image of what was supposed to be her signature, scrawled in black ink across the bottom of a form she had never seen. Her name was spelled correctly, but the handwriting was wrong. Looped in places hers was not, slanted in a way she never wrote. Still, it looked convincing enough that someone less familiar with her penmanship might accept it without question. Maggie felt a wave of cold anger wash over her. "That's a forgery," she said, her voice tightening. "You need to shut that machine down and leave." The older man with the hard hat gave a short, humorless laugh. "Look, lady, we're just doing our job. You've got a problem. Take it up with the folks who sent us. But we've got the paperwork, and we're on a schedule." He turned and signaled to the bulldozer operator, who shifted in his seat and eased the machine forward a few feet. The metal blade glinted in the early light, inching closer to the section of fence Ralph was guarding from inside. The dog's barking grew frantic, the deep, rolling sound breaking into sharp barks as he followed the movement of the machine. Maggie's chest tightened, not just from the thought of losing the fence, but from the danger to Ralph if the men pushed any further. "Stop that machine," she shouted, stepping forward, but the operator kept moving until the blade was just a yard from the wood. Maggie pulled her phone from her pocket, thumb flying over the screen as she called the police. She gave the dispatcher her address, explained that there were men attempting to remove her fence and that she believed they were acting on fraudulent documents. The dispatcher told her an officer would be sent, but Maggie could hear in the woman's voice that she was already trying to figure out whether this was a civil dispute or something requiring immediate intervention. She ended the call and turned back to the men. "You're not touching that fence until an officer gets here." The younger one smirked and shrugged. "We'll wait, but it's not going to change anything. The paperwork's clear, and the job has to be done." He stepped back, folding his arms as if he had all the time in the world. The bulldozer idled, its engine rumbling low, a constant reminder that all it would take was a signal from one of them to set it in motion again. Maggie knew she had to buy time, and she also knew she couldn't allow them to feel in control of the situation. She began asking direct questions: what company they worked for, who had hired them, which office had issued the so-called approval. She made a mental note of their answers, or in some cases, their refusal to answer. The older man kept glancing down the road, and Maggie caught the subtle way he tapped his wrist like he was counting down to something. She wondered if more equipment or personnel were on the way. By the time the police cruiser rolled into view, Ralph's barking had slowed to a growl, his body pressed against the fence as if he was ready to hold it up himself if it came to that. The officer stepped out, adjusted his belt, and asked for an explanation. Maggie spoke first, laying out what had happened, the forged signature, and her suspicion that the boundary change was fraudulent. The younger man interrupted more than once, insisting that they were authorized to proceed, but the officer raised a hand to silence him. He took the clipboard, studied the documents, and then looked at Maggie. "Do you have proof of your property line?" She nodded and told him the deed and survey were inside the house. It was clear the officer wasn't going to let the bulldozer move until things were verified, and that small victory was enough to let Maggie breathe for the first time since stepping outside. Still, as she walked back toward the house to retrieve her documents, she couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's confrontation wasn't just about a piece of fence. It was the opening move in something larger, something she hadn't yet begun to understand, and whatever it was, it had already crossed a line she intended to defend. The officer remained by the fence, keeping a casual but watchful stance, while Maggie went inside to retrieve her property deed and the survey her husband had commissioned years ago when they first bought the house. She kept both in a fireproof box in her office closet, a precaution her husband had insisted on after hearing too many stories of people losing vital documents to fires or floods. As she pulled them out, she thought about the forged signature on the clipboard and how cleanly it had been done. Convincing enough to pass casual inspection, yet just wrong enough for her to know instantly it wasn't hers. That kind of forgery didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen without someone having access to specific records. The question gnawed at her. Who had dug that deep into her affairs, and why now? When she stepped back outside, the men in reflective vests had shifted their positions. The younger one was leaning against the bulldozer's tread, his arms crossed in that same smug way, while the older man was on his phone, his back turned slightly toward them. Maggie handed the documents to the officer, who looked them over carefully, flipping between the deed, the survey, and the clipboard papers the men had brought. "These surveys don't match," he said finally, his brow furrowing. "Yours shows the fence exactly where it's been for years. The one they have shows the boundary shifted by nearly 6 feet. Maggie nodded, her voice calm but edged. Because someone falsified theirs. The officer turned to the men. "You're not doing any work here until the county confirms the change, and until I see something signed by the current property owner, not just a copy of an old agreement." The younger man's smirk faltered for the first time. The older one pocketed his phone without comment, but Maggie caught the hard glance he gave her, a look that wasn't about the fence anymore. It was the kind of look that said she had just made herself a problem for someone who didn't like obstacles. As the officer walked back to his cruiser to call in the documents, Maggie stayed by the gate, keeping herself between Ralph and the men outside. She could feel the heat of the bulldozer's engine radiating through the morning air, the faint tang of diesel mixing with the scent of damp earth. The men had stopped speaking to her entirely, communicating only in brief murmurs between themselves, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the road. She wondered if they were waiting for instructions from whoever had sent them, and if that someone was already looking for another way to get what they wanted. After nearly 20 minutes, the officer returned from his car. "The county office is going to pull the original records," he said. "It may take a day or two, but for now, nothing moves here." He handed Maggie back her documents and gave the men a pointed look. "If I get called back here because you decided to start without clearance, it won't just be a civil matter." The younger man muttered something under his breath, but the older one put a hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the bulldozer. They climbed into their vehicle, the engine revving as if in defiance, and rolled off the property line without another word. It should have been a relief, but Maggie knew better than to believe it was over. She watched the dust settle on the road long after they were gone, her mind already running through the steps she needed to take. She went inside and called her attorney, a practical and unflappable woman named Laura Kingston, who specialized in property disputes. Maggie explained what had happened, from the forged signature to the altered survey, and Laura's voice sharpened. "That's not something you can ignore," she said. "If someone's gone to the trouble of falsifying county records, they're not going to walk away after one failed attempt." Laura advised her to make certified copies of all her property documents and store them in multiple places. She also told her to hire an independent licensed surveyor to produce a current notarized survey of the property to reinforce her legal standing. Maggie agreed, and by the end of the call she had appointments set with both the surveyor and Laura's office. That afternoon, while Maggie was gathering other paperwork, Ralph started barking again, this time toward the far side of the property. She stepped out onto the porch and saw a white pickup truck parked just beyond the tree line, far enough to be off her land, but close enough for the driver to be watching. Through the glare on the windshield, she couldn't make out the face, but she could feel the weight of their attention. She stood there for a long moment, staring back, until the truck rolled away without any visible hurry. By the time evening came, Maggie had moved her fireproof box into a locked cabinet and placed a spare key in a sealed envelope at Laura's office. She double-checked the locks on the gates, made sure Ralph had water and food inside, and walked the fence line slowly, taking photos of each section as the light faded. The quiet of the night felt heavier than usual, as though the property itself knew a line had been crossed that morning. Somewhere out there, someone had tried to take a piece of her life with a machine and a forged piece of paper, and she had no doubt they would try again. What she didn't know yet was how far they were willing to go, and how ready she would have to be to stop them. 2 days later, the independent surveyor arrived, a middle-aged man named Greg Talbot, whose quiet efficiency and habit of noting every detail put Maggie slightly at ease. He carried a large, weathered leather case filled with instruments and paperwork, and after a brief greeting, he set to work without any small talk. Maggie watched as he moved along the property lines, planting his markers with deliberate precision, checking and rechecking his GPS readings, and occasionally jotting something into a small, battered notebook. Ralph followed at a distance, occasionally stopping to sniff at the markers, then trotting back to Maggie as if reporting progress. It was late morning, the kind of day when the air seemed almost too still, and despite the mundane rhythm of the surveyor's work, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was paying attention from beyond the tree line. Her suspicion was confirmed about an hour in, when Greg paused near the back corner of the lot, looking toward the edge of the vacant land. "You've got a watcher," he said quietly, nodding in that direction. Maggie followed his gaze and saw, half hidden between the trees, a man in dark clothing holding something small to his face, binoculars or a camera lens. The man didn't move when she looked straight at him, and after a moment he simply turned and walked deeper into the woods. Greg exhaled slowly. "That's not normal curiosity," he murmured. "It means they're tracking exactly what we're doing here." Maggie didn't respond. Instead, she took a slow walk back to the house, pulled her phone from her pocket, and called Laura, explaining what had just happened. Laura's tone shifted to something colder. "I'll have a process server deliver a formal notice to the company listed on those documents you showed the officer," she said. "And Maggie, do not engage with these people directly. If you see them on your property, call law enforcement every time. They're testing you for a reaction." The survey concluded in the early afternoon, and Greg handed her a preliminary map showing the boundary lines exactly where they had always been, confirming what she had known all along. "Once the county verifies this, you've got an airtight counter to whatever papers they're waving around," he said, packing up his equipment. "But be ready. If they've already falsified one set of records, they might try again." His warning lingered in her mind long after he drove away. That evening, while Maggie was sorting through a stack of old files in her study, Ralph let out a low, continuous growl. She stepped to the window overlooking the driveway and saw a van idling just past her gate, the kind used by utility crews. The side bore the logo of the local water department, but something about it felt wrong. The paint was too new, the decals too glossy compared to the worn, sun-faded ones she'd seen on real department vehicles. Two men got out wearing matching navy shirts and reflective vests and walked up to the gate. One of them called out, "Routine underground line inspection, ma'am. Won't take more than a few minutes." Maggie stayed where she was, her voice steady but loud enough to carry. "Show me your ID." The men exchanged a glance before one pulled a laminated card from his pocket and held it up from several feet away, too far for her to read the fine print. "I'll need to see that up close," she said. Instead of stepping forward, they muttered something between themselves and turned back toward the van. The engine roared to life before they had even shut the doors, and the vehicle pulled away without a word. Maggie immediately called the water department, where a supervisor confirmed that no crews had been dispatched to her address. It was no longer a question of coincidence. Someone was making coordinated attempts to get onto her property, and they were willing to impersonate official personnel to do it. She updated Laura, who told her to start keeping a detailed log of every incident, including descriptions, license plates when possible, and times. Maggie bought a heavy-duty notebook the next day and began filling it with meticulous entries, each one a breadcrumb leading back to whoever was orchestrating this pressure. A week passed with no direct confrontations, but the stillness felt artificial, like the pause before a storm. Maggie busied herself with work on her laptop in the evenings, the hum of the ceiling fan mixing with Ralph's breathing as he slept nearby. On the seventh night, well after midnight, Ralph jolted awake and barked sharply toward the rear of the property. Maggie grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the back porch. The beam cut through the dark, landing on something that made her stomach twist. A series of small, bright plastic stakes hammered into the ground along the outer side of her fence, glowing faintly under the light. They hadn't been there before sunset. She approached slowly, scanning the area for movement, but the woods were silent. The stakes bore no markings, but their placement was deliberate, forming a straight line parallel to her fence. It was the kind of preparatory work done before trenching or excavation, which meant someone had been on her land without permission, working in silence while she slept. She photographed each stake, measured their distance from the fence, and pulled them out one by one, tucking them into a large envelope. Back inside, she locked the door, placed the envelope with her growing pile of evidence, and sat at the kitchen table, listening for any sound beyond the hum of the refrigerator. By morning, the uneasy quiet had returned, but Maggie knew it was only temporary. She could feel the strategy tightening around her, testing the limits, looking for an unguarded moment, trying to wear her down into making a mistake. But if they thought she would retreat, they hadn't understood the kind of person she was. She had spent her entire career designing structures to withstand decades of wind, water, and weight. She knew exactly how to reinforce something under stress. And now, the thing under stress was not a building, but the life she had built, and she was prepared to brace it against whatever pressure came next. The morning after removing the stakes, Maggie drove into town to meet with Laura, bringing the envelope that now held not only the stakes but also printed photographs of the midnight scene. Laura examined everything in silence, occasionally nodding as she flipped through the images. "They're marking a trench line," she said finally, "probably for utilities or drainage, but in this context it's not legitimate work, it's encroachment. We'll file for a temporary restraining order against any excavation on or near your property until the ownership dispute is resolved." Maggie left the office with a signed affidavit to submit to the county, her steps deliberate, the weight of her determination keeping pace with the steady drum of unease in her chest. When she returned home just before noon, something felt off before she even reached the gate. Ralph was pacing along the fence in restless circles, and a faint metallic clinking sound drifted from the far side of the property. She parked quickly, left her bag in the car, and followed the noise until she saw two men standing near the same section of fence the bulldozer had targeted on that first morning. They weren't in reflective vests this time, but in plain clothes, work boots, jeans, heavy jackets despite the warm weather. One was crouched working at the base of a fence post with what looked like a pry bar, while the other stood watch. Maggie didn't shout immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began recording from a distance. When she stepped closer and called out, "Can I help you with something?" The man with the pry bar froze mid-motion. The lookout turned toward her, his face expressionless, and after a moment's pause he said, "We were told to check the stability of this fence." Safety inspection. His tone was flat, rehearsed as though he'd been expecting the question. Maggie kept the phone trained on them. "By whom?" she asked, but neither answered. The crouched man stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, and the two of them began walking toward the tree line without another word. She followed at a measured distance, still recording until they reached a dark-colored SUV parked partially hidden behind overgrown brush. The rear hatch was already open, filled with tools and heavy gloves, but no visible company markings. They climbed in, slammed the doors, and drove off in a spray of gravel. She stood there for a long moment, breathing steadily, the phone still warm in her hand. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was active tampering with her property, done in broad daylight. That afternoon, she filed the police report in person, showing the officer the video and giving as much detail as she could about the men, the vehicle, and their tools. The officer took notes but admitted it might be difficult to act without catching them in the act again. "Just keep calling it in," he advised. "The more reports, the stronger the pattern we can show." The pattern emerged faster than she expected. 3 nights later, Ralph erupted into a fit of barking so sudden and violent that it jolted her out of a deep sleep. She grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, catching a glimpse of movement near the back gate. A shadow darting away, followed by the metallic rattle of something dropped. She hurried to the spot and found a length of heavy chain coiled on the ground, along with a padlock whose shackle had been snapped. Someone had tried to lock the gate from the outside, trapping Ralph in the yard and blocking her own access to the rear of the property. She took the chain and the lock inside, photographed them, and added them to the growing archive of evidence. By now, she had adjusted her routines without even thinking about it, locking every gate the moment she passed through, keeping Ralph indoors after dusk, walking the perimeter twice a day. The quiet was no longer peaceful but tense, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She began to notice little things she couldn't easily prove, but that gnawed at her nonetheless. The faint scent of cigarette smoke near the fence one morning, fresh tire impressions on the dirt road that hadn't been there the day before, a screwdriver left lying in the grass near the east corner. Then came the letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, slipped into her mailbox without a stamp or postmark. The single sheet inside was typed, unsigned, and brief. "You can save yourself a lot of trouble by agreeing to the removal. This is your only warning." There was no phone number, no name, just those words in plain black print. Maggie read it twice, then slid it into a plastic sleeve and placed it with the rest of the evidence. She didn't bother calling Laura this time. She already knew the attorney's response would be to keep building the case, and Maggie was doing exactly that. The sense of pressure was constant now, a low, steady force pushing from every direction, but it wasn't wearing her down in the way they probably intended. If anything, it was sharpening her focus. They were escalating, and so was she, and sooner or later the two lines would intersect in a confrontation neither side could back away from. The break came on a Friday afternoon, just as the light was beginning to fade and the shadows from the tree line stretched across the yard. Maggie had been inside reviewing the final draft of the restraining order Laura had prepared when Ralph's bark shifted from his usual alert tone to something raw and urgent. She moved quickly to the back door, and through the glass she saw the same section of fence shudder as if struck from the outside. By the time she stepped onto the porch, the low roar of a diesel engine filled the air, growing louder with each second. A bulldozer, different from the one before but just as massive, was moving slowly down the side road toward her property, its blade already lowered. Behind it, a flatbed truck carried stacks of pre-cut fencing material, the kind used for temporary construction barriers. 3 men in heavy work gear were walking alongside the machine, and Maggie recognized 2 of them instantly. The plainclothes pair she had caught tampering with her fence days earlier. They didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, one of them gave a small wave, as if this was some prearranged appointment. She stepped forward until she was just inside the gate, phone in one hand and the other resting on the latch. "You're trespassing," she called out. The man in front raised his voice to be heard over the engine. "We've got clearance to remove this section. No point making it harder than it needs to be." Maggie didn't waste time arguing. She was already dialing the sheriff's office as the bulldozer's treads ground closer to the property line. She gave the dispatcher her name and address, making it clear this was a direct violation of an active legal order, then kept the line open so everything happening could be heard. Ralph was a frenzy of movement behind her, charging the fence each time the blade inched forward. The lead man gestured to the operator, and the bulldozer crept closer, its metal lip now just inches from the wood. Maggie stepped out from the gate, holding her phone high. "If that machine crosses this line, you're in contempt of court, and I have every second of it recorded." For a moment, the operator hesitated, glancing down at her and then toward the men on the ground. It was long enough for the distant wail of a siren to reach them, faint at first, but rising quickly. The men stiffened, their heads turning toward the sound. One cursed under his breath, and the bulldozer halted. The siren grew louder until a patrol vehicle pulled onto the dirt road, lights flashing. 2 deputies stepped out before the cruiser had even come to a full stop, their hands resting near their belts as they walked toward the group. Maggie didn't move, keeping her phone raised until one of the deputies reached her and asked her to step back behind the gate. She complied, watching as the other deputy approached the bulldozer and ordered the operator to shut it down. The air went still when the engine finally died, leaving only the sound of Ralph's low growl. The deputies spoke briefly with the men, took their IDs, and then turned their attention to the stacks of fencing on the truck. One deputy pulled a folded paper from his pocket and held it against the clipboard the younger man had brought. Maggie could see from the body language that whatever claim they had was crumbling under scrutiny. It took less than 10 minutes for the deputies to issue their directive. The men were to leave immediately. The equipment would be documented as part of an investigation, and any return to the property without lawful authorization would result in arrest. The plainclothes pair shot Maggie a final look, flat, unreadable, and then began walking back toward the flatbed. The bulldozer reversed slowly, its treads leaving deep impressions in the dirt as it backed away. When the last of them was gone and the road was quiet again, Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She knew this wasn't the final chapter. They would regroup, maybe try a different tactic. But for now, she had stopped them, here and in plain sight, with the law on her side and the evidence to make it stick. Ralph sat beside her at the fence, his body pressed against her leg, and for the first time in weeks, the air around the property felt like it belonged to her again. The days following the confrontation felt strangely quiet, as though the land itself was recovering from an assault. Maggie moved through her routines with deliberate steadiness, checking the fence twice a day, keeping her log updated, and forwarding every piece of evidence to Laura. The sheriff's office confirmed that a formal investigation was underway, with her case now tied to several other incidents in the county involving forged property documents and aggressive attempts to force landowners into surrendering ground. It was a relief to know she hadn't been singled out for some personal vendetta, but that knowledge came with its own weight. This was bigger, more calculated, and not easily dismantled. Still, the temporary restraining order was upheld in court, and the judge's words left no room for interpretation. Any action to alter, remove, or encroach upon her property without her direct consent would result in immediate arrest and potential felony charges. One late afternoon, as she sat on the porch with Ralph stretched at her feet, Maggie watched the sun burn low across the tree line, catching the top edge of the fence in a warm, amber glow. It struck her then how much of this battle had been about more than boards and boundaries. It had been about the right to decide, without coercion, what was hers and what would remain hers. She thought of the nights she had walked the perimeter with a flashlight, the mornings she had faced men twice her size without stepping back, and the constant hum of tension that had shadowed her days. She was tired, but it was the deep, satisfying tiredness that came after holding a line and not letting it break. Before going inside, she glanced once more at the yard, the fence standing exactly where it always had, and felt the smallest shift inside her, a settling, a quiet certainty that whatever might come next, she would meet it the same way she had met this. Not with noise or bluster, but with the kind of unshakable resolve that had carried her through every attempt to push her back. Ralph lifted his head at a distant sound, but when she didn't rise, he settled again, and for the first time in weeks, the evening passed without interruption.